So once Socrates actually asks Euthyphro for an account of what piety is, a definition, an explanation, that's the first act and perhaps the most important act of critical thinking, to demand, what would evidence be in this case? I mean, evidence is certainly what Socrates is looking for, but it's more like reasons, an argument, in support of his claim that what he's doing is pious. He must know what piety is, and to know that what he's doing is pious. But that's the first problem. When Euthyphro tries to define piety for Socrates, what does he say? I mean, what does he say the pious is? And why does Socrates reject that initial answer that Euthyphro gives? Well, let's think about what he says. Euthyphro says, well, what is the pious? Well, what I'm doing now. Prosecuting a wrongdoer for murder. That's pious. Socrates rejects that answer, but think about why. Does he reject it because he thinks that Euthyphro is wrong in his claim that what he's doing is pious? No. Socrates would probably say he doesn't know what the pious is, so how could he make that judgment that what Euthyphro is doing is impious? No, Socrates rejects Euthyphro's first answer to the question, what is piety, on different grounds. He says, what do you think I'm looking for? I mean, I'm not looking for an example of piety. I'm looking for a definition of piety. That is, if you ask somebody what is justice, which Socrates typically did, and I start pointing to examples of things that I think are just, that's not exactly unhelpful, perhaps, in explaining my opinion of what's just, but it doesn't really answer the question. That is, Socrates is looking for a definition of piety itself, not an individual instance of piety. So, what kind of answer is he looking for? Something that would get to the essence of what the pious is. Something that would serve as a kind of a standard. That is, if we knew what the pious was in general, we would have a standard for judging whether individual acts were pious or not pious or impious, meaning the same thing, I guess, as not pious. And that's the kind of thing that Socrates is looking for, is an account of piety itself, not pointing to instances of piety. And there we get to, what's really kind of the, I guess verbally at least, a little confusing aspect of the dialogue. That is, Euthyphro now understands, well, okay, I guess I've got to give a general account, a general definition of the pious or piety, instead of just pointing to examples, which really isn't a definition, I guess. Although some philosophers would disagree, but certainly Plato and Socrates don't think that that's a sufficient way to define a concept. So what does Euthyphro say? I mean, his answer now is in the form that Socrates wants, when he says that the pious is that which is dear to the gods or loved by the gods. And it's not such a bad answer, isn't it? I mean, if you have any notion of what piety means, and you should look it up. Look up the English word piety. It's not a word that is used much, I guess, in our culture. Part of the reason is that we have more or less a secular culture, I guess. But even amongst religious people, it's a word that you don't hear very often. But you should look it up. And really, as far as just like a normal person trying to define something, a normal person meaning not a philosopher, it's not so bad. But look what Socrates does to it. Kind of critical analysis and critical assessment that he subjects it to. And perhaps that began when he rejected Euthyphro's first answer because it wasn't in the form that Socrates wanted. Well, now the answer is in the form that Socrates wants. It's just that he begins to see some problems with it. And especially, look at where he attacks it. He takes something that Euthyphro said earlier about the gods quarreling with each other, and sort of not twists it, but he shows Euthyphro that his beliefs may be inconsistent. That as Euthyphro has shown that, like I would say, a typical religious Greek of the time, he believes the stories that he's heard about the gods and goddesses, where Socrates is kind of skeptical of those stories for various reasons. that the gods actually do argue and fight with each other, and Socrates says, well, mustn't that be because they have disagreements with each other and they disagree over things? And Euthyphro says yes. And what sort of things do we normally disagree over? Well, that which we find beautiful or just, and that which is dear to us. So don't the gods sometimes disagree about what they love, or what disagree about what is dear to them? Don't they differ? And Euthyphro says yes. Well, if and here's where an interesting thing, because Socrates has perhaps shown Euthyphro that his beliefs are inconsistent, and that notion of consistency, of course, is a big issue in critical thinking and in logic. That is, on the one hand, Euthyphro believes that the gods do differ with each other over what they love, but he has defined piety as that which is loved by the gods. But if the gods love different things, that is, the same thing could be loved by one god and hated, or at least not loved, by another, then that would mean that the same thing, by the definition of piety being that which is loved by the gods, would be both pious, because some god loves it, and not pious, because another god doesn't love it. So the same thing would be both pious and impious, and that violates the most central sort of principle of logic, the principle of contradiction, or principle of non-contradiction. The same thing can't be both have a property or be something and not be something at the same time. So what is Socrates doing with Euthyphro? What is he doing? Is he trying to humiliate him? I don't think so. Socrates really didn't do that sort of thing. He may be gently poking fun at him, and if you read the dialogue closely, you see there's a lot of irony. And Socrates may not have the greatest respect for Euthyphro's intellect, but he's fairly gentle in the way that I think that he kids him, and he does kid him. But he's trying to show Euthyphro that his beliefs are perhaps not very well thought out. That is, he has to, if two beliefs that you have contradict each other, and they really do contradict each other, you can't hold both of them. You've got to reform things. So either maybe the gods don't really differ with each other, and that idea doesn't make sense, or maybe the whole idea that piety is what the gods love is something that needs to be dropped and doesn't make sense.